Hello everybody and welcome back to another ship review episode, and today we are looking at the tier 6 premium German cruiser, the Admiral Graf Spee. And yes, she's a cruiser with those huge guns. Anyways, alright, so for those of you who are aware of World War II history, you're probably going to buy this ship just because of how famous she is historically. She took part in the Battle of the River Plate, and just a very, very well-known ship with a very well-known captain. Probably would buy the ship without even watching the rest of the video. However, if you're buying it just to see if you can get a good ship or whatnot, then watching this video is probably a wise thing. So what I'm going to do in this video is, again, look over all the stats, talk about anything that's significant, talk about her modules, talk about her captain skills, and then of course show you a bit of battle footage. So, Admiral Graf Spee. Survivability wise, this ship for a cruiser is quite solid survivability wise. Hit points 39,400, so that's good. That's the most out of any of the tier 6 cruisers. The Cleveland, which I think has the most HP out of any of the other tier 6 cruisers, tops out at about 35,200, so about 4,200 HP less. Armor wise, the Graf Spee does have cruiser armor, so do keep that in mind. This ship has cruiser armor, which means that if you are fighting other cruisers, you're going to be okay. Now, if you run into battleships, you're gonna get into a bit of trouble here. And this is very much historical too. The Graf Spee and this entire class of Deutschland class Panzerships were designed historically not to really engage battleships. These ships were meant to engage cruisers, and her armor reflects this. Now, for a cruiser, the Graf Spee does have absolutely phenomenal torpedo protection at 22%. That's close to battleship levels. You know, if you compare it to the other tier 6 cruisers, I mean, you can have as little as no torpedo protection to maybe less than 10% for most other ships. So, Graf Spee, fantastic torpedo protection, a large amount of HP, and cruiser armor that's good enough for dealing with cruisers. Battleships are a problem, though. Well, let's talk about her guns, because that is what makes the Graf Spee special. For a cruiser, she packs 283mm guns, and these are, well, these are fun guns to play with. She's got a total of 6 in total, 1 triple in the front, 1 triple in the back, so 6 guns in total. If you look at their stats, they reload nice and quick of 20 seconds, so a little bit slower than 203mm guns, but faster than most battleship guns. Turrets traverse pretty darn quick, 25 seconds to traverse 180 degrees, and the dispersion of 182 meters at 16 kilometers is worse than cruisers and better than battleships. So she's sort of in between there. She does at times, depending on how well you aim, she does have at times cruiser level dispersion, which means you can land 5 to 6 shots on target, but it really determines on what kind of target you're shooting at, whether broadside to you, and how well your aim is. Now, in terms of damage, HE damage on these 283mm guns is kind of meh, right? Max shell damage of 3,200, chance of fire 20%, so you're not really going to be using HE all that often. A lot of times what you're going to be doing is using the AP, which does 8,400 damage, 16 kilometer range, good muzzle velocity. You're going to be using that AP to try to find things that are giving you broadsides, and you're going to try to massacre them. Mostly you're trying to mess up cruisers, though. Because again, as she was designed sort of historically, okay at fighting cruisers, battleships, I mean, she can do damage to battleships. I'm not saying these guns can't. If you find a broadside battleship, you can hurt them. I mean, I've landed 12, 13, 14k salvos. You can get those kinds of salvos, but not really suited for engaging battleships. It's almost like the Scharnhorst syndrome, almost, although her dispersion is better, mind you, significantly, and you can land a good number of shells and do decent damage. But again, primary targets are going to be cruisers, not battleships. She does have secondary guns, and a decent number of them for a cruiser, but range-wise, stock range 4 kilometers, not really going to be using these all too much. And firing range, of course, 16 kilometers is pretty decent for tier 6 cruiser. Alright, The Graf Spee also comes with torpedo tubes. yeah, these very fun-looking armored launchers here at the back, and she's got a quad launcher on every side. Now, they are at the back, if you haven't noticed. And in battle, these torpedoes have phenomenal arcs of fire. As you can tell, they have very easy access to the front and very easy access all the way around, all the way to the back. So these torpedoes, phenomenal firing arcs. Now, they are, well, they're 8-kilometer torps, and this is also a very interesting number. 8 kilometers, German torpedoes, is something that is going to surprise people every once in a while. Most German ships have only 6-kilometer torpedoes, and they also go pretty damn fast at 65 knots. So these torpedoes can really surprise certain ships. So if you catch something in an ambush, ooh, you know, you can do some serious damage there with your torps. In terms of damage, though, 13,700 is alright. I mean, you know, it's not the best, but it's decent amount of damage, especially, again, because of range and speed. So, decent torpedo armament as well. A defense is a little bit on the lacking side. You have some 20mm AA guns, you got some 37mm AA guns, and you got a couple of the 105s, which you'll notice the majority of damage is actually in these 105mm AA guns at the longer ranges. And of course, stock range is 4.5 kilometers. Now, you're gonna probably want to get a captain skill that maybe increases the AA range a little bit, but even though the raw damage isn't all that great, the Graf Spee is not really all that vulnerable to aircraft. She does have access to scout fighters and defensive fire. She also has, like I mentioned earlier, that pretty solid torpedo defense. So for a cruiser, you can actually take a torpedo or two and might not be as bad from aircraft, that is. Now, maneuverability is where the Graf Spee isn't really much like a cruiser. Max speed of 28.5 knots is a bit on the slow side. Turning circle radius of 680 meters, that's okay. But stock rudder shift of 10.3 seconds is rather slow. So, unlike cruisers, which can use their agility to dodge shots and things like that, the Graf Spee is going to struggle with that a little bit more. Plus, 28.5 knots is okay when you're running into, let's say, tier maybe 6 battleships that are slow, but that speed, if you run into tier 8s, Amagi, or Bismarck, or Tirpitz, you're not running away from them. And of course, their guns are going to do a hell of a lot more to you than you can do back. So she does have struggles, like I mentioned earlier, when she runs into battleships, and it's probably going to be something you're going to try to actively do, which is dodge battleships and try to find pockets of cruisers and mess them up. The other thing, of course, is that, now this is something I missed earlier, the combination of her rather slow speed and her sort of lack of agility, and the fact that she has these big sort of battleship-ish guns, and not that many of them, only 6 in total, means that you are going to struggle when you run into destroyers. Yeah, this cruiser is definitely going to have issues dealing with DDs, so something else to keep in mind. And finally, her concealment. Concealment, it's alright, 12.7 kilometers. Surface detectability is a little bit high. But again, if you pack some concealment expert on your captain, and you should be able to get that number down a little bit to a number that's a little bit more reasonable, shall we say. Now, on to modules. In terms of modules, first of all, the consumables. The Graf Spee has access to defensive fire. She also has access to hydroacoustic, but I would recommend getting defensive fire just because A is a little bit weak, and if you have defensive fire, you're at least safer from carriers. Without it, you're quite a bit more vulnerable. In Tier 6, there are quite a bit more carriers. You also have access to a catapult fighter, and of course, you have access to a repair party. Now, this does help your survivability. This is going to allow you to stay in the fight for longer, and remember, since you do have a rather large HP pool, you do get a decent amount of heal per second as well. Alright, now in terms of the actual upgrade modules, I would say probably want to opt for main armaments modification 1, which is quite standard. Then you want to get aiming systems mod 1, just to get those shells a little bit tighter, a little bit better dispersion. Then you want to get damage control system modification 1, and finally you want to probably go for steering gears just to have the rudder be a little bit more responsive. Captain skill wise, pretty straightforward actually on the ship. I'm going to bring this captain over here because I was using my Gneisenau captain. It's spec'd for the Graf Spee. I would say go with basic firing training first, then get expert marksman, then get superintendent, then get advanced firing training, and then get concealment expert. And then once you've gotten past that, I would recommend maybe things like basics of survivability. Maybe you want to consider things like incoming fire alert, or you want to consider things like last stand. Those are all viable skills. Anyways, now that we've covered the Graf Spee import, let's see how she performs in battle. Alright, so talking about the Graf Spee, you really have to go back to what I was talking about at the very beginning. This ship really does sort of fit exactly what she was supposed to do historically. So she can basically outrun anything, at least historically, she could outrun anything that she couldn't fight, and she could outfight anything that she couldn't run away from. Now you have to keep in mind what the designers were thinking about historically. They were thinking about, well, if she ran into slower Royal Navy battleships, then she could run away from them because she couldn't fight them. But if she ran into cruisers, which are going to be faster than her, she had the bigger guns. And when you play the Graf Spee in game, you basically run into exactly that particular kind of situation. Running into light cruisers, running into heavy cruisers, not really something that will worry you. You can deal with them. Your guns are big enough, you've got those torpedoes as backup, and your armor is good enough that you can bounce your shells if you are angled. And if you were to run into tier 6 battleships, so things like, and these were the ships that, historically she was designed to fight, you're going to be okay. So slow battleships like the New Mexico, or in this case the Colorado, ships like, for example, the Warspite, or if you run into a Bayern, these lower tier battleships that you could actually run away from if, let's say, the fight wasn't going all that well. The problem for the Graf Spee really begins, well, first of all, you do have problems dealing with destroyers, but I'll get to that in a second. The real problems really start when you run into ships that historically the Graf Spee was never designed to fight. So that's running into bigger, badder battleships. So if you were to run into something like the Gneisenau, if you were to run into something like the Bismarck, or the North Carolina, or the Tirpitz, then you really struggle, because suddenly you meet a bunch of battleships that you can no longer run away from. You can't outfight them. Then the struggles are real. So if you are thinking about getting the Graf Spee, the thing you really have to keep in mind is that this is a ship that is, it's going to be okay at tier 6, it's going to be somewhat okay at tier 7, but Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are bad news. And she really, really struggles if she gets into a tier 8 battle. Now, again, like I mentioned earlier, if you can find the cruisers, yes, you can definitely do some harm. And of course, if battleships give you broadsides, then definitely you can do some damage. Now, the ideal range, by the way, of engagement, if you're playing Graf Spee, I would say is probably between, I would say probably between 14 kilometers and down, maybe even less than that, 13 and down even. At long range, shells are just not doing all that much. At around, let's say 13, 14 kilometers, if you're hitting broadside battleships, you can still do some damage. Cruisers, ideally, I would like to engage cruisers even a little bit closer, maybe sub 11 kilometer range. So, the engagement range is a little bit, not like a little bit on the closer side, namely because, again, she's got these sort of battleship guns, although they do have sort of, like I mentioned earlier, the in-between dispersion. Her dispersion's not bad, but there are going to be those salvos that are a little bit on the wild side. Now, again, in this particular case, for example, I'm fighting a cruiser, an Aoba. Doesn't really bother me, because here's a cruiser that I know if I got into any kind of fight with, I will win, because guns are bigger and I can definitely do quite a lot of damage per citadel. So, this is the thing about the ship you really have to remember, right? If you're going to fight stuff, you're going to have to constantly be looking for cruisers to pick on, or just really advantageous positions, right? Where ships are giving you broadside and you're not really being focused by anything. Because again, remember, cruiser armor, if real battleships are shooting at you, you're gonna be in trouble. You did notice the torpedo arc that I just launched these torpedoes towards at Colorado. Very, very nice arcs. And these torpedoes are longer range. So yes, they can surprise battleships. So if you're a battleship captain and you run into a Graf Spee, you do have to be wary of those torpedoes. You also do have to be wary of those guns, because if you're giving a broadside, these guns can hurt. They are, after all, still light battleship guns. And with decent dispersion, they can get decent amounts of damage. Now, that was not so good, but I've definitely had salvos up somewhat closer to, let's say, an enemy broadside battleship, where I've been able to get probably somewhere in the range of 12 to 14,000 damage per salvo, which is quite nice. And if you, I guess, get really close, there's even a, well, maybe not super, super close, at a reasonable range, there's even a chance you would get citadels as well. So, Graf Spee dealing with battleships, not ideal, but yes, you can do some damage, but don't expect to go head-to-head with a battleship and come out on top. Unless, of course, that battleship decides to give you the easy torpedo run, then anything could happen then. Cruisers, generally no problem, right? It's like cruisers at just about any range, you should be okay. The Graf Spee does really struggle, though, when it runs into destroyers. And that's mainly because she just doesn't have the number of shells or the rate of fire really to scare destroyers off. In a way, the Graf Spee, in this case, is very much like a battleship, and destroyers are going to be able to come and ruin your day. And yeah, fighting battleships head-on usually doesn't end all that well, although I do manage to actually tag this Colorado with, I believe, 2 torpedoes, and actually got the Colorado to flood to death. This was actually a pretty darn good battle. I think I ended up netting about 141,000 damage, and you know, that's really good. In most cases, for me, the Graf Spee, I mean, I think I was looking around maybe 60,000 damage, maybe. Every once in a while, you get one of those sort of high damage games, maybe 1 or 2 high damage games, then you get maybe even 1 or 2 really low damage games where, yeah, again, she's a cruiser, right? So while I liked, for example, the Scharnhorst, which, you know, had the armor and the small guns, which I liked, the Graf Spee for me wasn't really all that great. I'm not a huge fan of cruiser armor with none of the maneuverability, really. One good lucky battleship salvo, and you're going back to port quite early. So, you know, you have a couple of the high ones, a couple of the low ones, but a lot of them just sort of end up in that mid-range area. A lot of it has to do with the fact that, you know, she doesn't really have the rate of fire to be that super effective sort of HE spammer, but her AP at the same time, while good, is not super high sort of damage amounts. So the Graf Spee is, yeah, you're gonna be able to get a couple of good games, but all in all, I think most of their battles are gonna be somewhat sort of average, really. Although, speaking of average, I mean, if you look at the average damage of other Tier 6 cruisers, you know, average isn't all that bad, even. But you know what? I mean, all in all, and by the way, I'm not wrapping up yet. There's still some more stuff to show. All in all, my impression of the Graf Spee is that she's one of those sort of fun ships to play. A fun cruiser, you know, interesting gameplay style, and I think that if you got a ship like this and you took her into random, by the way, you know, you'd get salvos like this, and like there, 12,500 damage on the side of a Bayern. You just have to give that battleship to give you that broadside. Now, if you run into good battleship players and they never give that to you, yeah, you're probably going to want to disengage from the fight. So against the Bayern, you can do that because you're at least faster. But if you run into something like a Gneisenau or a Scharnhorst, I mean, they can literally chase you until, yeah, they just kill you slowly. Or even if you run into a Bismarck. I mean, I've run into Bismarcks and Tirpitzes, and those are just bad news. Those are terrifying ships to run into because they're faster than you, they have bigger guns than you, and you can't run away from them because again, historically, you weren't meant to fight these kinds of ships that you're going to be put into these kind of battles with. Anyways, so go back to what I was talking about earlier. Taking a ship like the Graf Spee into random battles, I think can net quite a bit of fun. Even if you don't do particularly well, just having these sort of big guns that you can scare the crap out of cruisers with, that's a fun thing to have. And enjoyable in that sense. But would she do well as a competitive ship? I would probably say not all that much. So, for the Graf Spee, really you have to be, like I said, either somebody who's into the history of it and will get it regardless, or someone who just really sort of enjoys unique ships with their sort of unique playstyles that are just different from everything else. And if you are one of those kinds of people, then go for it. Now, if you're looking for a ship that, let's say you're strictly looking at a ship from, is she going to be a competitive ship that I'm always going to be able to do really well in, or, well, I mean, I guess if you have certain select kind of playstyle, then the answer is probably yeah, but I think for the great majority of people, the answer would probably be not so much. Truth be told, I would say that if I looked at the opinions as well of other people who've tested the Graf Spee, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some people really got the ship to kind of work, and then some people just couldn't make it work at all. And that's kind of going to be the scenario that you're going to run into when you get the ship. Either she really works for you, or she doesn't. Now, for me, and this is a lot of this I think has to do with the way I guess play ships. I generally prefer ships with either a little bit more armor or a little bit more maneuverability if there is not enough armor. And the Graf Spee just doesn't really work there. I mean, she doesn't have enough armor to really absorb hits from anything bigger, but at the same time, she doesn't have the agility to really avoid all that much either. So, for me, the Graf Spee didn't really work. Her guns were fun. I mean, they're definitely sort of these fun guns that you can play with. Like I said, you can surprise battleships. You can definitely mess cruisers up really badly. But, again, I had this problem where it's just like at times you would run into cruisers and they would be angled, and then your guns just didn't do all that much because they just weren't that punchy enough. Yeah, the Graf Spee is one of those kinds of ships where you're either going to love her or you're not going to love her, right? Either she is something you play frequently or she sits in your port and collects dust as a sort of a museum piece. It's like, I would like the Graf Spee as a museum ship in my port. That's kind of what you're going to get. Like, that Colorado hit me on the side when I was reasonably angled and still took quite a chunk of damage there, so yeah. Now, if you run into, like I said, cruisers, they generally are going to have a bad day, but if you run into battleships, typically you're going to have a bad day, although you are generally going to be able to output a reasonable amount of damage onto a battleship. Like, again, you have these torpedoes that are very nice, and you also do have guns that have some punch, especially at close range if you run into something that's giving you a broadside. See? Reasonable good salvos against a cruiser, citadels, not that hard to get. Positioning wise, and this is another thing, right? Earlier I mentioned sort of the range that you want to play in. The Graf Spee, again, strangely very much like history. She's okay if you're fighting 1 versus 1. It's like you run into a sole cruiser by yourself, not really much of a problem. If you run into even a sole battleship, you should be able to hurt them. But if you run into even a group of cruisers, let's say 3 or more, right? Kind of like the Battle of the River Plate again, you're also going to struggle there. Like, I ran into, in one instance, 3 cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 1 heavy. And I struggled royally. You ran into ships that, with that many things shooting at you, like, you're ready to fire. Again, the number of shells you have, not enough output of damage to take them all down in rapid succession. So in a lot of cases, you're pretty much going to have to stick with your fleet, offer them that sort of anti-cruiser ship that, maybe battleships don't always have to worry about cruisers. You can sort of take that role. But you at the same time require help from other cruisers to deal with destroyers. And of course, you need your battleships to take the attention of other battleships away from you. And final verdict time. If you're looking for something unique to play, that's something that's different than everything else that's in the game right now, and of course, if you like history, then sure, you can grab the Graf Spee, and she's an enjoyable ship with some fun quirks about her. However, if you're just looking for a good ship, good sort of being the key word there, then depends a lot more on your individual playstyle. I mean, if you like the way she plays, then go for it. Otherwise, I would say this is a ship that you might want to take a pass on. Anyways, folks, I hope this review has been helpful for all of you. If you've got any questions about the ship, please do leave those in the comment section below. Aside from all that, take care, have a good one, and I'm looking forward to talking to all of you again really, really soon.